Welcome everybody, and hello if you're watching, and hello again if you're in the ether. And today we're going to do something a little bit different from what I normally talk about, but I think it is a really important topic to tackle, especially for men, because I don't necessarily believe that we deal with our emotions, our mental health, our mental state, as well as maybe women. I'm not saying this is an and/or conversation. And a social media post on LinkedIn caught my attention from a friend's and a former client's, Amir, who just talked about what he's been doing for Mind during the month of November, which is the month where November kind of focuses on mental health, and you can see that Amir's got a fabulous moustache on his face. So, Amir, thank you so much, for agreeing to come on this, because I know that we were talking off air what you were thinking. So enough about me. Amir, let's hear your story, why you're passionate about this, passionate about Mind in particular as a charity, and let's be open and talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you first of all for having me. I'm very glad to be here, and it's important, like you say, I think for men especially to talk about mental health, and I'll touch on that a little bit in just a second. But for me, mental health is something I've always been passionate about. I think especially as a young teenager, and when you're going through adolescence, just the idea of, you have your ups and downs, and that's fine, and everybody does. But I think especially as a man, this wasn't even that long ago, and attitudes have changed since then, but since I was growing up and was a teenager, and around the start of the tens, the attitude was still get on with it, don't talk about it doesn't really matter, you can just get over it, man up, all of that kind of thing. And I used to think that I was just maybe a little bit sensitive, and used to try to really be tough and all of that kind of thing. And I think when I was around the age of 18 was when I had my first proper tussle, I think, with mental health. And it was more, rather than one thing in particular, it was more just, I'd say a mix of mental health, aspects, rather than, a sort of a severe bout with depression or anything else. It was more, for me, it was more around what I later learned was one of the symptoms of OCD, although I wouldn't say that I have OCD, but was around the idea of uncontrollable thoughts, and then the sort of compulsions that you have the physical compulsions you have to try and stop your, as almost like you're trying to combat yourself from thinking or feeling certain things, and trying to bring that under control. And then, that led to a lot of low mood, low self-esteem, and then with that then comes, although I wouldn't say full-blown anxiety like I know a lot of people have who do struggle with anxiety in a more severe way, but then that leads to anxious thoughts, anxious feelings, and for me it was more a mix of a lot of, I would say, maybe not as intense or serious aspects of different parts of mental health, but then together just having quite an impact on my life at the time. And this was for a lot, same as for a lot of people when I was going to university that first year, which is, I think, as I've realized from the campaign that I'll touch on in a second, is when a lot of people have their first, I think, real kind of experience of mental health, because you're going through life changes. Biologically, you are, you're just a young adult. You still have, I think, all the, leftover hormones from puberty or something like that, probably. So yeah, that was how I sort of first experienced it. And I think it was something that felt quite isolating at the time and felt like a flaw, and never really thought about it in terms of mental health until someone in my family encouraged me to go to counselling and speak to somebody about what I was going through. And for me, that was, and this is back in 2011, that was my first exposure to the idea of mindfulness and a lot of the tenets that come with mindfulness about disconnecting from your emotions and not seeing yourself as defined by how you feel, and all the way through to doing breathing exercises and that kind of thing, which now is the sort of thing, thankfully, a lot of people do pretty regularly, through the things like Headspace and Calm and lots of other great apps and ways of doing that. So for me, I think my really the short answer is just I had mental health. I think everyone has a mental health, and my mental health had a bit of a turn at one point in my life, and then after that, once I started to be able to manage it a bit better, it has its ups and downs. It's never a straight line. But then you notice and you talk to other people who have other problems with mental health, and you just really start to realize how everyone has a mental health in the same way that everybody has a physical health. And we all need to take care of it, even though it's to varying degrees. And it's just something that affects literally every person in the world, but that is still not properly talked about, still has effects that people don't fully appreciate or understand. And there's still a lot of stigma around, and that leads to a lack of funding and all of those things. And there was something you said earlier, which leads me on to how I got into the campaigning side of things, is when I say campaigning, I mean the fundraising campaigns, which was the idea of, if I can do something to help one person, will that help anybody else? And about a year and a half after that first major kind of run-in with mental health for me, I did Movember. Just the idea being, if I can raise a little bit of money and that makes a bit of difference, that's great. That's a good thing. That'll be great. And in that first year, I raised about I remember exactly, actually, £351. And that's actually the only year I've done Movember for the official Movember charity. But it was kind of how I got into the fundraising side of things. Because the year after, I had a close relative die from cancer, and because Movember is related to cancer and mental health, I thought, okay, I'm going to fundraise specifically for cancer that year. And then the next year I thought, well, I'll specifically fundraise for mental health, because again, someone close to me, this was when they were having their kind of their own real kind of experiences with mental health, which was much more severe than anything I had been through. And then it all kind of snowballed from there. Each year, the goal was just to raise more than the year before. But from that first year raising for Movember to then raising for Macmillan, it increased threefold. And then the next year it doubled again. So we were up to about £1,700 in 1 year. So that's when I just realized that I have a generous network of people who are willing to give every year for mental health. So I may as well keep on doing it. And one of the things you mentioned was LinkedIn posts, and the whole campaign has been social media. And for the first few years, I kind of noticed that the funnier the posts were, or funnier I should say, the more people gravitated and the more people would donate. So then I got into the idea of thinking of who are famous people with mustaches, or who has the word Mo in their name, or things like that. So, and then just doing sort of caricatures, parodies, memes, whatever you want to call it, of those people. And it just, for whatever reason, I think maybe it's because it was a fun way of talking about a serious topic, but that made people talk about it, that got people to open up their wallets. So over the last 8 years, and this year being the 9th year, we've managed to raise over £32,000 for Mind, which has been really cool, and something that I never would have anticipated. I think when I first did Movember, my goal was, if I can get to £100 to 3 figures, that would be great. So it's just amazing to see how it snowballed. But I think a big part of that is because of the conversation around mental health, and because of things like this, of people talking about it more. It's led to that appreciation and action around it, I think.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for kind of sharing your story. And what is kind of what does Mind do? What's their kind of their purpose in terms of the money that you've raised, for them? How is that going to help them help people?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a great question. And I had the good fortune last year of, before everything was shut down, to actually go to the Mind headquarters office and just meet some of the staff and talk to them about it. I think the great thing about Mind is they do things at all levels of action that needs to be done around mental health. They'll do campaigns and things to raise awareness, and awareness is something that I want to talk about in a second, actually. But they do loads of stuff to raise around awareness. They have talking therapies and helplines for people. They put lots of good resources out on the internet and on social media that I think are really valuable for people. But then they campaign at a political level as well. So even just as recently as yesterday, Mind helped push the government into taking action on and recognizing the effects of mental health in the pandemic. And I don't remember the specific. I don't remember specifically what was passed, but it came off my LinkedIn feed, and I thought to myself, that makes me really proud to support Mind. So that they've lobbied for years to the government for statutory changes around mental health, and that stuff makes a difference, because raising money is super important, and being able to fund the talking therapies and things that they do like that is really important. But I think people don't necessarily realize how many resources are involved in a charity, and how much goes into being able to successfully make changes like that happen on an institutional level. And I think we forget that that's really important, because it was only in the last century that suicide was still a crime, and people were punished by the law if they tried to commit suicide. And that's why people are now saying, don't use the phrase commit suicide, because it comes from committing a crime, because that was the way it was seen. So I think that's what I really like about Mind, is that they're focused entirely on mental health, but they do things at all levels, and they really have the power to make big changes like that happen. Yeah.
No, that's and I had no idea the term commit suicide. I actually completely forgotten that suicide was a crime back then. I had no concept of the word commit in terms of, obviously has the legal connotation, the legal connotations to it. So just taking a step back, then you mentioned when you started to realize that something wasn't quite right in your head, and we've touched on that, and you and I were talking about this before we came on air, is that recognizing that there's something happening, stage one, I believe, but then it's talking to someone else about it. So what did you, in terms of, you mentioned a family member that suggested you go and get some help, how were you able to make that decision in your mind that it's okay to talk to a family member? Because we've touched on that, especially as a man, got to man up, bravo, all this kind of machismo stuff. You shouldn't talk about your feelings. So how do you then go to your dad, your mum, your brother, your sister, your aunt, your uncle, your grandparents, whomever, to go, actually, I'm not feeling great mentally, and I need help?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, it kind of happened in two ways for me. I think at first I'd got to the point where I started to realize that, and I don't know what it was that made me realize this. I don't know if it was through media and things becoming a bit more, the idea of opening up and talking, that narrative becoming more prevalent. But I had started to talk to people who were close to me about things related to what my mental state was, but not about it directly. So I would talk about all the problems that were happening as a side effect, but I would never talk about that root cause. And I personally felt a real sort of shame around it, and I didn't want to tell anyone. And I think the shame aspect of it is what made it so much worse for me. I felt like I was, you're 18 years old, you're really gung-ho, you feel a bit invincible, and you feel like, life's perfect, life's great. Why do I feel this way? I personally, I'm very lucky to come from I have a very privileged background, and I remember thinking to myself, I have no reason to feel this way. Why am I feeling this way? And that's how it ended up impacting my mood and my self-image, because it was kind of that sort of first, brick that sort of fell, and that was what really, everything else came tumbling down. So I think what really ended up, I think I kind of got to the point where I had to speak to somebody about it, because it was just, I think it just started to affect me so much that people close to me were able to tell that there was something wrong, even though I wasn't talking about it. And I think one day I was, and because I would feel upset, and one thing men don't talk about is crying, and I was feeling incredibly low mood, incredibly low self-esteem at this point, and I used to cry in secret, used to do all the things that come with bad mental health in secret, out of shame, and I was still living at home at the time. I hadn't moved to university yet, so my mum just found me and just started talking to me, and that was when I started to realize that I could talk about it. But even then, it was still about 9 months until I went to, about 6 to 9 months, I would say, until I went and spoke to somebody properly. And I think by that point, it was just the idea of, I've tried talking to friends about it. I've tried, at the time, I thought I'd done everything I could about it. So I thought I need to speak to somebody now. And that's something that I think is really important that people don't realize as well, is it's really important to talk to people, and it's really important to talk to your family and your friends, and people in your wider network, like we were saying earlier, before we went on air. But I think what people don't, the next step that people don't make is realizing that the best person to actually talk to is a professional. It's definitely, always talk to your friends, always talk to your family if you're comfortable to, if you're able to, if they're in a position where they're able to support you. But I think if you really need help, you really have to talk to somebody about it, and someone who can professionally help you, because otherwise I think you're only going to get so far. And that is just such an important step. And I think that's where a lot of people, and myself included, have failed to take that step. And I think when you talk to people who have, which has been the kind of how I've tried to develop the campaign over the years, has been talking to people about their experiences and trying to do interviews with people about them, is when people talk to professionals and they get the help they need, which more often than not does not always have to revolve around medication, it makes a big difference for people, and that's when people can start to actually manage their mental health and feel like it's not overcoming them.
Yeah, and it's not. And again, back to the point, it's not a stigma. It's not a you go to the doctor when you're not feeling very well, whatever it might be. And to your point around, the brain needs exercise. Your mental health is no different from your physical stuff. Not like the body can break down and needs fixing. And when I've torn my rotator cuff in my shoulder, so I'm having to have physiotherapy from an expert to fix it properly. Otherwise, if I let it go by itself, it'll get worse and worse and worse. And then later on in life, that's going to impact you. Your brain is no different from that. I don't want this to be about me. This is very much about you and your experience. But the pandemic, and then I want to come on to maybe mental health in the workplace, because I do believe that in some industries, possibly all industries, that's not being looked at enough. But the pandemic is for everybody. It is for everyone. Now, yesterday, our Prime Minister saying that the virus doesn't know it's Christmas, doesn't care what time of year it is. And back to your point around being from a privileged background, I'm from a very privileged background. I'm very fortunate to be in the situation that I'm in. I live in a very nice house. My wife and I have their own office space. We have a decent sized garden. We've been able to have childcare the whole way through, hugely fortunate. We've had it really, really easy compared to other people, yet I have had, and I write a blog about this, I have had some moments where I think they were anxiety attacks, I think, of some shape or form, where I was sitting there as a sole director of a company, fall through the cracks in terms of any of the government help. And it was things like watching, so when lockdown kind of happened, the first Monday, I had about an hour kind of meltdown of just sheer terror as to how am I going to pay the mortgage, how am I going to look after kids, how am I going to provide, putting it all on me, not necessarily thinking about there's two of us in this relationship and wider people. And then it was silly things. You talk about crying. I cry from time to time. I was watching, I think it was BBC, and I might even go now thinking about it, watching the BBC documentary around sporting events that had happened, that should be happening. I was sat there looking at all those happy people, looking at the stadiums for the people, cheering their teams on, like the Olympics when it was the Super Saturday. I just burst into tears and just started kind of crying uncontrollably, going, are we ever going to get back to that world? And the point for me is that you said mental health affects everyone. It doesn't matter what strata of income you come from, but for me, the pandemic has kind of really focused the mind, if you will, that you need to talk to people. So what has Mind seen, or what have you seen, any changes that happened because of the pandemic in terms of this being talked about more? What's kind of the experiences that you've seen or stuff you've read about from the varying Mind and the charities that you work with?
It's a really interesting one, because I think it's quite mixed across the board. I think you're absolutely right. This is like the type of what we're living through now is probably the closest to living through a world war that I think any generation has seen since the Second World War, I'd imagine, in terms of just how it has affected everyone, society, the economy, our way of life, day to day. So I think in terms of how you see that manifesting on mental health, there's a superficial level and then there's a meaningful level. And superficial doesn't necessarily mean bad, although sometimes I think it can be bad. That's things like, on social media, you see a lot of, and I've seen a lot of this, a lot of posts about checking in on your friends, and a lot of talk about, you see a lot more discussion around mental health, but it sometimes doesn't feel, and I think this, again, this is probably the double-edged sword of social media. A lot of the times you see things like that and you think that you can see that it's maybe, it's kind of using mental health as a hashtag, as a way of getting attention, and sometimes it's a bit hollow. And I think that actually, for people who struggle with their mental health, is probably more isolating and affects people more. I think that idea of raising awareness, and this is something that I've really noticed over the pandemic. That's where I think you get into this situation of it's important, but there has to be substance and meaning behind it. And I think people in the pandemic have, and in my own circles, I've noticed people find this more and more frustrating, because I think more and more people are coming to grips with their mental health at the moment. And I've spoken to, as part of this year's campaign and part of the interviews, a lot of people who have said, I haven't really struggled with my mental health until now. So I think people are waking up and sniffing out when things are disingenuous about mental health a bit more. Which is good, and it's also bad, because you don't want it to damage the overall narrative and importance around mental health that is there. But that's one thing that I've really noticed, is that kind of, one, the sort of broader realization of a lot of people around mental health, and two, also I think people are now more aware of when, of the way that people can sometimes, romanticize mental health, which is equally bad and dangerous in terms of misconceptions and stigma. On the other hand, or perhaps on the same hand, you probably see the government talking a lot more about mental health than they ever have done. I mean, I've never noticed the government refer to mental health as much as they have. When they talk about the negative sides of lockdown and the impacts of lockdown and the effect it has on people's mental health, which is good. But then, why have we never heard the government talk about this before, in such a way? And ultimately it is a good thing, but you realize, and I think it's down to the organizations like Mind and the Movember charity and Samaritans and all of the other great charities and organizations out there who have really worked to actually raise the profile and importance of mental health, that it's being given the attention being given more attention it needs. I'm sure it could deserve even more attention now, but it's getting more and more attention during the pandemic than I think it probably would have done otherwise. So I think you're seeing that side of things as well. And again, that kind of comes back to that earlier point. And I found it on my I was on my Facebook feed, so I've managed to recall what the thing that mine did was, which was mine had a petition for this winter around a winter mental health support package from the government, and the government announced that they would do that as a result of mine's campaign and pushing for this, and that's the kind of the less superficial level, the important things, because that will probably have longer reaching impact, and that opens the door for more conversation and acceptance in the government. I mean, if mental health affects people seasonally every year, would we have ever seen anything like this in previous years? Probably not. So it's been really, I think it's been very multifaceted, the way that the pandemic has affected people's mental health. Well, I'm sorry, I feel like that was a very disorganized answer to a very straightforward question.
Not disorganized at all. And it's the old adage, actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
And the superficiality of social media, completely agree with you. And then you do see, and it's not just mental health, there are other kind of charitable campaigns that happen during the year. And you see kind of from a corporate level to individual levels, kind of people jumping on the bandwagon per se, because they need to be seen to be talking about it.
Yeah.
But just to kind of flip that on its head, and is this something to consider the likes of mine to kind of also offer this service? And this is going to kind of move me then into kind of that workplace environment, but also, for anybody listening to this, it's also, do we need to train people, coach people, how to have the conversation with people that maybe they suspect have got mental health issues, but without it coming across as being superficial, or they themselves are kind of fearful, I don't know how to handle this, so I'm going to let someone else deal with what I perceive to be a problem. So much like you approaching your parents, but your family your family spotting things, my guess is there may be people out there, I'm thinking, and again, think from a workplace environment, managers of teams, leaders, whatever level it is, they're just not equipped to go, well, it's the employee-employer relationship. That's a personal thing. Take that home. I'm not equipped to even deal with that.
Absolutely. I think that is a real problem. And I think that people do need to be trained around that. But it's I guess I think that comes down to a few different aspects, I think. One, I think, some managers in a lot of organizations probably don't get any people management training at all, let alone how to do this. But on the flip side, which is a good thing, is organizations are offering things like, and not companies, but charities are able to do this now, where they offer mental health first aid, which, on the face of it, to a lot of people probably sounds ridiculous. Well, what is mental health first aid? But that's what that revolves around, is being able to have those conversations with people, being able to help somebody if they're having a panic attack, and being able to spot things in other colleagues, people you work with, or people in your life, and being able to give them those first steps of help. And I've not personally done this, not yet anyway, but I know of a couple of people who have done it, and somebody spoke about it in their interview last year for the fundraising campaign, which was that they've done mental health first aid, and they found it really helpful, because not only is it useful just for people to have in a work environment outside of work, but I think it helps people themselves as well to notice within themselves if they're starting to spot the signs of if they're having an episode of mental health, or if their mental health is getting a bit worse. So I think organizations absolutely need to be doing this. And I think it's it's really important in the workplace, because I think the workplace for a lot of people can be a source of a lot of negative mental health, whether it is around financial stability, like you were saying, which has been incredibly important over the last year with the uncertainty and the economic impact of COVID and the pandemic, but also just around if people are having bad relationships with managers or in high pressure situations. I think it's really important for people to have that training, and organisations like Mind are starting to offer that, and have been for some time. But there is a big disconnect with industries and with the workplace and being able to do this. And I think the legal industry in particular is one where overworking is glorified. It's almost like you have to be having 90-hour weeks as a trainee or a young associate, if not more, to really kind of earn your stripes and to have those credentials that later in your career you can say, I did this just like everybody else above me did that. And I think I probably can't remember the number of friends I've had who, when they were doing their training contracts, would be talking about their, the magic roundabout of going home in one suit, having a nap and a shower, and then going back into the office in another one. And it's, I know it was something you wanted to touch on, was how it affects different industries. And I personally think the legal industry is one that now is paying a lot of, rightly or wrongly, lip service to the idea of mental health, but also has a lot to answer for in terms of that sort of work yourself to burn the candle at both ends type of mentality, which isn't healthy and causes further mental health problems, I think.
I agree, and we both are in that industry, and we see it from the kind of you see it from a slightly different lens from your perspective. I see it from a slightly different lens from my perspective, and I hope it doesn't take we've already seen some tragedy over the last 18 months in terms of, and again at a very senior level. This isn't like necessarily juniors. This is people at senior leadership, really senior leadership level, for global firms, unfortunately taking what they believe is the only route out of this situation, which the knock-on effect of that is just terrible in terms of the human tragedy that has. And I agree with you. I know that a lot of work needs to be done, and we'll see what comes of that, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely.
Indeed.
And that kind of comes back to the idea of, I think, talking about it as well, and we refer, that final step and suicide is something that people, I think, as we still talk about mental health, and as the conversation gets better around it, I think there's still an element of, not necessarily maybe stigma, but maybe awkwardness or uncertainty around those conversations when it gets to that really, really severe side. And I think that's something that, conversation-wise, people need to, we can't necessarily maybe prepare everyone to have this conversation, but when we talk about mental health first aid and ways that people can help in the workplace, that's something that is very real, that could happen. And people, I think, I know personally, if a colleague came to me and said, I'm feeling this way, and I'm really considering suicide. They're feeling suicidal, or not even necessarily saying it, but doing things that exhibited that you would feel that way, they would feel that way, I wouldn't know how to have that conversation in the best way, and I think that most people definitely wouldn't. So it is really important to prepare people not only for the smaller conversations, but the bigger ones in these kind of high pressure workplaces. Because, like you said, there have been a number of tragedies in the industry over the last several months, and those are just the ones that we probably know about.
Exactly.
Unfortunately.
Indeed, and it's suicide. It needs to be talked about. It's a thing. It happens, and it's impacted me, not directly, but friend, someone I was friends with in my teenage years, way back when, last summer, married, appeared to be happily married, went missing, post on Facebook, can we find him? And unfortunately, 2 days later, he was found, and what that's left behind. And you think back to looking back at, people were posting photos of all of us down in Devon at the beach together, laughing, happy, smiling, and you think, Christ, if only, only he could talk to somebody. He's left a loving wife and two children behind, and it's just the wider impact that has. But the brain's a funny thing, the mind is a funny thing. If it gets you into such a situation that you genuinely believe that is the only way out. The person that married myself and Nicola how many years ago, unfortunately, a man of God, felt that life was too much and took his own life. And it's just, you sit there and think, how can someone like that, when we look back at our wedding videos, end up in that situation? A man of God, a man of Christ, in terms of, religion's a separate thing. It's like, it impacts everybody. So that's why I wanted to not talk about it, but this in terms of all of it is get you on here to just talk as two men, because we don't talk about it. And to your point, I know that you were wrestling with this beforehand, is that if what Amir and I have talked about, any of you, this changes your thought process and gets you to want to pick up the phone to me, pick up the phone to Amir. We'll put the links to Mind and any other link to Amir you think are appropriate for people to go and do that. Please do that, because there is a way out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I'm really sorry to hear that. That's awful. But it does. You're right. It is just it just does come down to the idea that people feel like there is no other way out, and I think that's what a lot of people don't realize when it comes to suicide. You often hear people refer to it as the easy way out, but just think about how incredibly tough it must be for someone in that position to feel like that is the only path left, despite like you say, the things that they may have in their life. That's and I think for the reason why suicide affects men so much more than women, I personally believe, and I wouldn't be surprised, I'm sure there is research that backs this up, but it's just because socially, historically, men do not talk, and not talking, to your point about anyone who is watching this, if they need to talk to someone, to please do so, is because it just makes it so much worse. There's that old adage, problem shared is a problem halved, and it's might not be that simple, but it is definitely true. And I think the opposite is especially true, that if you keep something just to yourself, if you don't talk to anyone, let alone getting help professionally, you just it just gets so much worse than it ever needs to be. So I would I think it's always important to just talk, and that first conversation might seem like such a small insignificant step, but it's so important, because without that first step, then you never get to the end destination.
Indeed. Amir, thank you. It's been an absolute, I'm going to go now. I'm going to go. I'll try not to go. I was sitting there, I can feel the lump in my throat coming up. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Genuinely has. Thank you so much.
And you as well.
And offering your time. We'll put the links to Mind and any other links you suggest that I should add to this podcast to reach out. The links for your charity page and so on. But from the bottom of my heart, genuinely, and hopefully all my listeners who are watching and listening, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Some really important conversation to have. So it means a lot that we were able to do this. So a big thank you to you.